Begin the current Daf, Mesechtas Nedarim Daf Nun Ches. Begin on the bottom line of Menzayin Mebeis, where we continue the discussion that we introduced in the previous Daf. As we'll see shortly, the reason why we introduced the whole discussion was because we're going to bring a raya from our Mishnah. The Gemara had introduced a question regarding if someone had something that was a onion from the Shemitah year, and they planted it in the 8th year. Now it actually increased so much more in the 8th year that it would have enough to be mavatal the quantity that it had from the Shemitah year. The question was, as the way the Ran explained it, do we say that the growths that come out of the Dvar Isser is going to be considered as heter, and therefore it'll be mavatal the Iker? Or do you say that no, that it's an outgrowth of the Isser, it's going to have Isser too, and it's not going to be mavatal the Iker? So the Gemara had answered that, yeah, it's going to be mavatal. On that, the Gemara asked the one who said that, it said, what do you mean? You have two sources that say that is not mavatal the Iker. And that he wants you to bring a right. He says, no, I'll bring you one of the two sources you bring me. Of Rabbi Yechanan, I'll show you the Rabbi Yechanan holds that it is mavatal. Which the Gemara, the last thing we said, was no dimul chumer shani. Maybe, truthfully, I'll tell you that, no, Gidul are not mavatal the Iker. But over here that we say that it's mavatal in the case of you have a liter of onions that you were masakin, that you took off trumas maisa and then you replanted it, that you have to take off now maisa lefikula. That's only we're going to say the bittul because it's astringency. It's going to make you take off new trumas maisa. But in general, for heter, for kula, maybe that I wouldn't tell you, so you don't have a rise. You still have 2 against 1 and say that you're not mavatal as ikar. That's where our Gemara is up to. Just goes past because in the cheskel turns of Daf Yomi doing for today's Daf. Something to discuss in today's Daf are, like we said, this concept of geduli heter, permitted growths, are they malnus isser or not? And some of the concepts we'll see in today's Daf that are critical in changing this equation is zarakala. If the seed disintegrates, so then you don't really have that much from the original isser in the new growth because it just totally deteriorates, and now a new thing comes out of that. Meduchin, it was grinded before it's planted, and Isur Shviyas, as we'll see, because since the Isur Shemitah is in regard to Karka, so therefore maybe Karka, when you plant it, you replant it, it'll go ahead and create a bittul in contrast to other Isurim. Some important concepts that come in today's Daf regarding the laws of bittul are min b'minoi, min b'shein minoi. When you have something that it's the different species, generally that is dependent on can you recognize the Isra over here, which is in Tam, and generally that halacha is batal b'shisha, that we say a ratio of 61, you're not going to be able to taste it, whereas min b'minoi is a machlekes regarding how do you go ahead and is dir bittul and what the amounts are going to be when it's the same time. Davashish matirin is the concept that if something has a permitted way of having it, so then actually you're not going to say bittul no matter even if you have 1,000, because why should we nullify an isser if there's a way that it's going to be totally permitted? So we begin the current Daf Nun Zayin Mebeis, the last line on the Amid. As we said, the Gemara it had a question. Now it's citing several brises to resolve the question of Geduli Heter when you have the growths which are permitted, because it's not in, let's say, in the vineyard anymore, because it's not in the Shemitah year anymore. Whatever it is, the growths are growing in the permitted way. When you say there's a malness isser, the original bulb of the onion, the original thing that's usser, would it be mavat le'ikr or would it not be mavat le'ikr? So the Gemara quotes Elam Nahad the Tanya. Okay, so again, the Gemara is trying to defend its premise that the Gemara had answered that of Rabbi Yanai had said, meaning with the halacha, Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha had quoted the halacha of Rabbi Yanai to show that you see it's mabatal the ikr. I brought Rabbi Yomi and says not. I'll bring you a different raya. And how did the time? Rabbi Shimon says the following halacha: the continuing time of the Nechesem and Al. Called Dovish Matir. Anything that has a permitted way of having this isser could go in, for example, tevel. If let's say untyped produce gets mixed into regular permitted produce, why is that considered as it has matirin? Because you could separate trumas and maisus on that untyped produce from somewhere else. You don't have to tell me bittul that the tevel is the untyped produce is bottle in the chulin. Right? It has matirin. You could permit it. It's not going to be the isser anymore. Or let's say a maiser sheni. The second type, like Taisa explains, you could bring up the maiser sheni, eat in Yerushalayim. It's mutter over there, or you could redeem it. So there is matirin for it. Or let's say a hektish. Hektish you could permit by redeeming hektish. Or the chadash. Chadash is the new grain that when you bring the carbon it's going to be permitted. So regarding all these things that have permitted ways of having it, the sages did not give a measurement of bittul. What does that mean? Because they actually will be prohibited even a minute amount when it's the same type, when it's b'minot. But the Ran points out, shaloi b'minan, when it's a different, it gets mixed into a different species, a different type of food, then it will be qualified b'nois and tam if we give it a taste, because since right now it is aser, and the Ran went through great detail of the Bezim and Aleph, so that would apply for the contrast of bittul. Now, he just points out, interestingly, in the last paragraph of Avodah Zarah, the Gemara actually gives a different reasoning why Tevel is aser b'mashu, why it's not going to be batal. Because just like permitting untyped produce, to give off truma, you really need just a minute amount. You can take one kernel. So to isurah, the isur is also going to be a culture. Whatever, that's the Gemara says over there. But here we're quoting a different reasoning, is because it has matir. Okay, continues the brisa further. Anything that does not have a permitted way out could go in truma. Nothing to do for truma. Can't redeem it. With trumas meiser, or which is the meister mina meiser that the Levi gives to the kohen, or v'chala, or which is also one of the matnas kahuna, which actually the Ram points out, even though you could be shoyl on chala, you could go to the Rav and tell him that that it was separated the chala, I don't want this to be the chala, and I want it to be something else. But since there's no mitzvah to do this, he says that the Gemara is going to tell us later on the next daf, test, that's not considered double shesh material. So interestingly, even though you could permit it, it's not a mitzvah to do that, and therefore it's not considered double shesh material. Okay. V'arla, the fruits in the first 3 years also are isur hana. There's nothing to do about it. There's no way of permitting it. The kla karim, a forbidden mixture in a vineyard. So regarding all these things, nosamem chacham shir. The sages did give a measurement, meaning even if it got mixed into its own type, it's going to be batal. What's the shiur? So the Ram points out that truma and trumas meiser and chala are, which are matnas kahuna, are batal b'meya. It's a ratio of 100 to 1. Arla, klai karim, which are isur hana, are batal b'mesayim, has to have a ratio of 200 to 1. That's b'minai, and when it's einah minai, they're all going to be b'shishim, because that's if it gives taste or not. Okay, fine. That's what Reb Shimon says. Amrullah, they said to Reb Shimon, what do you mean? Is your principle really hold water? But Valei Shviyas, regarding the laws of Shemitah, in Lamatirin, there's no way of permitting Shemitah produce. Shemitah produce is aser, you can't redeem it. And Valei Nosim B'chacham Shir, and still the sages not give a shir, meaning there's no shir of bittul, meaning it's going to be aser even in the mashu. That goes against your principle. You just said that anything that has no matirin, then they did give a shir. And I'll prove to you from Shemitah, not like that. Why? Did not like the Mishnah says the Shviyas. Mishnah says, Hashviyas Beiseres Kol Shuhu. Shemitah produce prohibits in a minute amount b'mina, with its same type. Meaning, whether you have a mixture of, let's say, permitted produce that gets mixed into Shemitah produce, or whether you have the growths, and this is really the main point, what we want over here, or whether you have the growths, for example, if you have an onion from the 6th year that was planted in the Shemitah year, and now you have a taravis because you have a growths in the onion of the Shemitah year, you see, say the Chachamim to Reb Shimon, that it's going to be aser, even a minute amount, even though it's a davar she'ein lo matir. So, Ammalahan, he says to them, Afani lo marti, which, or what it really means to say is, also, they didn't say that the Shemitah is going to prohibit things, even a minute amount when it's the same min. That's elul labir. That's regarding that you have to go ahead and eat the mixture before the time of liquidation. There's a halacha called beer. You have to get rid of the Shemitah produce by a certain time. That's what it means to say that there's no share, that you have to go ahead and consume it before that time. Because since it's possible to eat it, that's considered davar sheyesh lematirin. In Shemitah, you're allowed to eat the Shemitah produce. So regards to that is when we say it's not going to have halacha bittul, because that is considered davar sheyesh lematirin. In other words, if let's say it gets mixed in to Shemitah produce after this amount of beer of getting rid of the Shemitah produce, which if that would be the case, then if you're going to make the mixture forbidden, you're not going to be able to eat it, and there's no matirin. Oh, then it's been nice and tam. Then says Reb Shimon, it's if it gives a taste. That's whether but for eating, whether it's for the mina or she'ena b'mina, it's going to be nice and tam. It gives a taste. Okay, that's Reb Shimon's response. What's the Gemara bring a raya from this? Obviously, you see that the growths are not an extension from the roots to have the same halacha like the roots. Because if that would be the case, how are you telling me that it's going to become forbidden, this onion, from the 6th year, that was then planted in the 7th year, that it's going to become forbidden, but this onion is a 6th year onion. So who cares that it grew in the 7th year? Because you're telling me that the tarevis that it has, the way that the Ran explained the case, is talking about that you took a 6th year onion, you planted in the 7th year. And now you have a kol shehu, that you're telling me that Hashaviyas Oyser is kol shehu b'mina. Okay, we got into a discussion, this machlekes and this brisa. It's not the main thing that we want. That's the shaila, is that considered yesh l'matir and ein l'matir. So Rishon responded, it says, this was mashu regarding the laws of beer, because that is matirin. But if not, then my principle does hold water, and that since it's ein l'matir, then there would be halacha bittul. That's regarding eating. Okay, meaning after this man of the beer. But one thing is, says the Gemara, the way the Ran explains, that obviously the growths are not like the ikr. And that's why we're saying that if you take a 6th year onion and you plant it in the Shemitah year, that little growth is going to make it forbidden. Because if you held that the gedul, again, this is the way the Ran explained the concept of the Gemara's question previous up. If you hold the growths are manifestation of the root, so that's the concept of not being mavat the ikr. And then you would say over here that Shemitah would not make it forbidden because it's an extension of 6th year bulb of the onion. Obviously that it's not an outgrowth, and that's what's going to be forbidden in this case. But that answers our question from the previous daf, that if you went the other way around, if you took a 7th year onion and you planted in the 8th year and you have 200 growths over that of the Shemitah, that it would be mal neseka. So you see that we hold that because if it would not be ein malin, obviously the in other words, if not, how can you resolve that from the gedulin that it's going to be usher? Obviously, no. In other words, the Ran also wants to prove from here that you see his concept that we hold that if we don't say that if we say ein malin, that we say that the growths are not going to be mavatal the ikar, because the Rishonim, Tais and Rosh disagree with him. He wants to prove from here, like he holds, that obviously gedulin is like the ikar, meaning that the Gedulim themselves would be aser. Some Rishonim want to say, no, the Gedulim mutter, they grew in the 8th year. The whole shaila is, I could have been mavatal the ikar. The Ran says, no, obviously, you see, like me, that if you hold ein malin, obviously that means the Gedulim mean like the ikar itself. Because if not, how are you proving that from the fact that the Gedulim are aser, that it's from the Shemitah element, that it's going to be mala? Obviously, like we're saying, because it's proving the idea that it's an extension from the source. Because that's what we're saying over here. You take a 6th year onion and you plant it in the 7th year. You're proving that it's not an extension from the 6th year, and that's why we're saying it's going to go ahead and be mavat. Okay, that's what he wants to prove. But al kaponim, the Gemara is at the point now where seemingly it's bringing a raya that yes, like Rabbi Nafta said, that gedulin are mavat the ikar. Says the Gemara, no, it's not a raya. Why not? Because v'dilma maybe over here, the growth of the Shemitah year, when you took the 6th year onion and you planted in the 7th year, maybe those growths is not milucham rishani. The last Gemara we brought on the previous daf, the Gemara had also thought it's going to be a raya. The Gemara said, no, dim lucham rishani. So the Gemara says, here also maybe as a stringency it's different. So what are we saying the halacha is? We're saying you took a 6th year onion and you planted in the 7th year, and I said, I said it's b'kolshu. So you want to bring me a raya? I say, wait a second. I thought you told me that it's an outgrowth of the ikar, and so how could it make it usher by like the little bit that it grew? It's not a 7th year growth. It's an extension of the 6th year bulb. Obviously, you're telling me that no, it's independent, and therefore that's why you could say that when it is heter the other way around, it can move off of the ikar because it's not an extension. That's why the Ran explained that to Toli Zebazet. Says the Gemara, no, it's not true. Me'ikar, then I would tell you that the Gedulin are like the Ikar. And therefore, we don't say that what comes out is Heter, and it's Isser, and it's not going to be Maleh to Mimatr. Here is a stringency. Here I'm telling you that the permitted 6th year onion, we're going to say is going to be Asr. But as a Kula, no one said we'll take a 7th year onion and say with the growths came in the 8th year, that's going to be permitted. Now, the Ran says, it appears to me, he says, we already had this Gemara on the last Raya. We already said Dim Luchum Rishani. So why does the Gemara want to resolve it from this brisa, why would we have thought it's going to be any different than the previous brisa? I would know already. I know already Dimluchim Rishani. So it says, no, the Gemara would entertain to say that you wouldn't be able to reject simile in this brisa, because I understand the previous case we brought in the previous daf. There was only one stringency we're making, that we're going to say that the Gedula is as if it comes from elsewhere, even though really we hold that it's not Mal Neseker. And if we hold not Mal Neseker, it's really an extension of the Iker. But that's it's a different. But to say L'chorma, I'll say that no, it's like as if it's not coming from there. So I understand you'll say one chorma, but over here, if you say L'chorma Shani, you have to make two chormas. So the Ran says that's why the Gemara entertained to say that you're not going to say two chormas unless you held that's the halacha. First of all, that for the laws of beer, that since it's like that, there's matirin, you're going to tell me that it's Oisher B'Kolshu, but he says that's a chorma ba'alma. And also the fact that Gedulim, that the halacha is not to say it's Aser even in a lot, you're going to say it's Aser B'Kolshu, that is another chumrah. And even so, the Gemara rejects and says, yes, that yeah, I'll make two chumras, and therefore it's not going to be a raya to this halacha that the Gedulim are Mevatla Se'ikr. Maybe it's only as a stringency, I'll say, but not as a leniency. So the Gemara says, okay, Menhada Pashta, I'll prove it to you from a Mishnah that's not a Mesechtes Shvius. The Mishnah says the following halacha: B'tzalim, onions, shiur dalim geshana, that it rains on these onions in the Shemitah year, and then it causes it to sprout. So it says the Mishnah, it depends. If the onions, if the leaves are black, so the Ram says it doesn't mean literally black, it just means that it's leaning towards black, which that proves that its growth is very strong, and that it's really growing from the ground now in the Shemitah year, and therefore asurinus can be forbidden because now you have Shemitah growth in this onion. Hariku, but if it's greenish, so since it's greenish, so that's not really because of the growth of the ground that it's growing. It's just because of the onion itself. If you just leave an onion in your kitchen and you see suddenly it's having growths coming out of it, so then mutaris can be permitted because that's not growing from the Shemitah, from the ground. It's growing from the onion itself, which is a 6-year onion. That's what the Tanakama says. Hananya ben Atignas, he says, if it could be pulled by its leaves, then that's when it's forbidden, because that's obviously proving that it has a very strong nourishment from the ground, because that means to say that the leaves has a very strong. When you're going to grab a hold of the leaves, you're going to be able to pull out the whole bulb from the ground. That means it's strong. It's not one of those weak things. So therefore, it means to say it's really nourishing from the ground. That's Shemitah growth. That's forbidden. Now, and correlating the same equivalency when we're talking about after Shemitah year, mutarin is going to be permitted. Meaning, if you took a Shemitah onion and now you have it the same test, you did the same test of pulling by the leaves after the Shemitah year, that's going to be permitted, because that means to say these leaves for sure have more growths on the post-Shemitah year than on the primary bulb, which is mixed into from the Shemitah year. So then that's going to actually permit it. Just like it'll make it forbidden, it'll make it permitted from a post-Shemitah pull. Now, obviously, that the growths are not an extension from the Iker. To the contrary, we see that the growths are malanaisai from the post-Shemitah growth, even as a leniency. So you see, I mean, this is really the question we had asked in the previous stop, the original question. Taking a 7th year Shemitah, taking a Shemitah onion and having the growth in the 8th year. Here you see seemingly clearly from the Chanenda ben Atiknois that, yeah, if the leaves are very strong, it means they grew in the 8th year, it's going to be matter, it's going to be mala, as a ikar. So you have the answer to your question. Says the Gemara, is that to say the Geduli had to mal as a that the permitted growths elevate and nullify the prohibited shiur, the root? Says the Gemara, no. And this is another variable that we introduced, like some of the other things to say why it could be different. But maybe we're talking about where you crushed the onions before you planted it. Since you had crushed the onions, so it makes it inferior. And therefore, the growths are not going to be an extension from the root of the bulb itself. So it's not going to be a raya in general. Maybe in general you would say that, yeah, well, you have a bulb of an onion, the growths are coming from the onion itself. Maybe it's going to be forbidden. But when you crushed it, So they don't retain the Isser, those Gedulim, and therefore that's why we didn't say it's going to be Mal less Isser. So it's not a Raya to a regular case of when it's not, hasn't been crushed beforehand. So the Gemara says, okay, Element Hadid the time, let's bring another Raya. Let's get into the base. Hamenachish. Someone's doing Nikush, which is pruning, which is he takes off the extra leaves of the produce, and he's doing this imhakuti. Kuti is the Kuthins. There were these groups of Gentiles that were brought from the land of Kuth, and then they took over the space where the 10 tribes were. And he's doing this b'chasayas. I was going to explain later on. Chasayas are types of produce that the seed does not disintegrate. For example, like garlic and onion, those things, the bulb always remains. You take a kernel of wheat, it disintegrates into the ground, and then becomes something else. But these things, they don't disintegrate. So what's the halacha if you're pruning with the kuti? So you could snack on these chasayas that you're pruning with him. What does that mean? What's this halacha? So the Ran explains, we're not concerned that maybe before he planted them, they had already been tevel for meiser, because that maybe it had already been finished, its processing, before it had planted. You're not concerned for that, to say that it's tevel for meiser, for two reasons, says the Ran. First of all, the meiser of these onions and garlic are only rabbinic. It's not the biblical dog and tirish v'yitzir, so we're not concerned. Number two is also, we hold that by a kuti, that he doesn't take meiser. As actually the next halach is going to say, uma'asan vadai. That the type that you take off from the kuti, let's say ama oretz, a lot of times we say we don't know, it's called demai. We're not sure if it took a meiser or not. Kuti, we know for sure it doesn't take a meiser. So we could presume that this chasayas, these onions, whatever they are, garlic, had never been to the granary before, because they don't usually make a garin from chasayas, only for the purposes of making meiser. So, be it as it may, this halacha is saying that you'll have a snack from it because it never became tevel yet, never went through that process. Okay, and asin vada, you could when you take off meiser, it's definitive because we know by kuti it doesn't take off meiser. So when you're going to take off, because you let's say are buying from him and you have to take off meiser, yeah, it's a definite, which is difference in halacha if it's suffix or it's definite. It's definite meiser. Reb Shimon ben Elazar, he says another halacha. He says, if you have a Jew who is suspected regarding laws of Shemitah, we suspect him that he would plant these chasayas of Shemitah in the 8th year. So, l'matzah shvi is mutter. In the post-Shemitah year, it's going to be permitted to eat those leaves that grew in the 8th year, because most definitely the growths are more than the root of the Isser that's mixed in with them. Oh, says the Gemara, l'memra, that to say, tigeduli heter, the permitted growth of the 8th year, mal as Isser, elevates and nullifies the prohibition of the 7th year. Again, you see, the Gemara is trying to defend Rabbi Shloimy Schwartzberg in the previous Daf to show you that geduli heter am about neikar. Says the Gemara, no. V'tilma b'davar shazar kala. Maybe we're talking about something that the seed disintegrates, like grain. Oh, but something that the seed does not disintegrate. That was our whole question. Remember, we started off the whole Gemara's discussion in the previous Daf with an onion. Onion is our whole question was, of course, something is zav v'kala. That's not something that is something that would be telling me the gedulim are coming out of the acre, because that totally disintegrates, not coming out of the acre. But when you take an onion and it keeps getting bigger and bigger in the ground, and the original root stays there, oh, maybe over there. So you can't bring me a raya from this chasayis. The Gemara responds, you can't say that. Because Atani will in the Braisa, Elun Chazayis, what are chasayis? Remember, this case was chasayis. Chasayis is kagain haluf. Luf is a type of legumes, and the seed does not disintegrate by these beans. Or hashum, garlic, vabitzolum, and onions, which these are also things, garlic, the seed does not disintegrate. And even so, you're telling me that the geduli shminis is mevatel, the ikr from the shmiyas. Oh, so you see, we're back to our proof that geduli heta mevatel as ikr. So Gemara says no. They were talking about that he grinded these chasayas before he planted it. And like we said before, if you took an onion and you grinded it, well, it's not as strong anymore. And it's not really coming from the ikr anymore. And maybe the other gedul ma heter, and that's a mevatel as the ikr. So the Gemara says, Yeah, but chasher al shvis katani. With the case was talking about that we said, Rabbi Shimon Allah was talking about, we suspect this Jew of planting Shemitah produce in the 8th year. And as the Ran explains, for someone who's chasher and shvis, he's not going through the effort to grind it up beforehand before he's planting it. He's a chasher. So if that's the case, again, it sounds like it wasn't grinded. And if it wasn't grinded, we're still saying, don't worry, you're working with this chasher yid, it's mutter for you. Because it's more gedul in the shminis than it was in the ikka of the shvis. That's geduli hatim about maseka. So the Gemara says no. The dimon b'tad maybe it's talking about that it's a mixture. In other words, that they got mixed by themselves afterwards. These chesayas that we suspect with other chesayas, with other vegetables of heter, and you're eating it through a mixture, and that's why it's permitted. Because since the ikr is not be'en, so therefore, because it's totally mixed in, it's a tarevis, that's what can be mutter. But if it would be be'en, for example, like the question of Yishmael that started off this question, maybe I would say that no, gedula heter would not be malnas as a iser. So the Gemara says, no, you can't say it's talking about a mixture, and that's why it's permitted. Because hamanachish ketani. What was the case of this? We're talking about when he's pruning, which sounds like he's pulling it out of the ground now. There's no taroivis at this point. So therefore, says the Ram, we have resolved the question. That we see clearly, the way the Gemara stops over here, that gedulin of shminis are mavatin the ikr of shvius, and therefore we see that gedulei heter are mavatin es ikr. So the Gemara turns around now and says, okay, you just proved it like a bisam nafcha, but we had brought, and that's what the Gemara originally started off. We said, why are you picking one? And then we have two against you. Why are you saying this? And so we said, no, I have a raya this. No, that's not a good raya. I have a raya this. No. And ultimately, we just brought a good raya. We brought a raya from a brayso. Says, okay, let me talk to you to Rabbi Yochanan. We had quote on the previous Daf Rabbi Yochanan, who said that when you have a young tree in the first 3 years, it gets grafted with an older tree, and it has peiros, it's going to be usher, even though it grows so much more with the older tree, which doesn't have a problem of arla. And we said at Rabbi Yochanan that said a case of an onion that's planted in a vineyard, even though the vineyard gets uprooted, and now it keeps on growing this onion, it's going to be usher. Obviously, they hold that gidulin are not malanese ikar, but now we just brought a raya from this last Tanoid teaching that we see that it is. So what do we do with Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yochanan? So Rabbi Yitzchak says, and someone yesterday tried saying that Shemitah is different, and here we finally come to the Gemara which says it, Shan Yeshvius. No, your raya right now is from the laws of Shemitah. Shemitah is different. Why? Since its prohibition is through the ground, like the pasuk says, B'shav sa'aretz, the isser of Shemitah is an agricultural isser. Meaning it comes through the ground because you're not supposed to work the ground. So b'telasa nami adei karka. So its nullification could also happen through the ground, meaning when you have it planted in the ground and it grows in the ground, just like the isser is adei karka, the bit will be in the karka. But the halachas of Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yonasan, we're not talking about Shemitah. You're right, the question that Yishmael started off with, which was a Shemitah halacha, yeah, we just proved from Shemitah, and that's okay. Everyone could agree to that. Rabbi Yochanan and their halachas say that it's not mevat l'zikah. They're talking about different things. Orla is a lacking of maturity that caused the issur. It's not a karka issur. It's not the growth that made it forbidden. It's that it's not yet 3 years. Klaim also is not a karka issur. It's a tarevis of different minim in the ground. Oh, there could be gedulim. It's not mavat l'seikah because it's not isura de karka, so it's bittles now de karka. And it does not refute Rabbi Yochanan, although it answers our question on the previous topic. So the Gemara says, wait a second. Hare masa. What do you do with meiser? What do you mean? Isura de karka. Meiser, the prohibition is through the ground. I mean, it's not telling a certain date. It doesn't have something else because it's mixed in with. It's an agricultural isser that it's tevel. And the imitelosa de karka, and yet its nullification is not through the ground. The time learn the brayso. If someone has a litra of meiser tevel, meaning to say that this litra of tevel is meaning because the person had already separated from this produce truma and meiser rishon. But the Levi now that he has his meiser rishon actually interestingly is considered tevel. Why is his meiser rishon tevel? Because he didn't separate yet from his meiser a meiser to give to the kohen, which is called trumas meiser. So if you have a literal meiser that's tevel, now he planted it in the ground, bishbicha, and it got improved in the Shemitah year. It's talking about he planted it in the Shemitah year. So it got growth in the Shemitah year. Now what happened was this original liter now, it was a great year, very extra liter. Now one liter turned into, it multiplied by 10. It's 10 liter right? Says the Braisa, what's the halacha? So chayeves the Braisa, it's obligated in meiser, right? And that is meaning which meiser? Meiser mina meiser, the trumas meiser, which was originally obligated before it was planted, meaning to say that it's not going to be bottled regarding the other litrin, which grew in the Shemitah year, which those litrin are pater, because Shemitah produce is hefker, which even the Leveim could take it, so it does not have a chiyuv or kayanim, so that doesn't have a chiyuv of trumas meiser, or any maskuda for that matter. So it's going to be chayav meiser ubeshviyas, meaning you have to liquidate all of that 10 litrin before the time of the beer because of the gedula, because of the growth that grew. Now, ba'isa litra, now that original litra, which I'm telling you, you have to take off still trumas meisers from that original meiser, ma'asav aleha, you'll take off this meiser from that meiser, mimokam acher, from elsewhere, because as the Ran explains, from it itself you can't, because since the additional litrin are potter, that will be taken from potter al-achiyim, so you can't take from it itself. You got to take it from somewhere else, that 10th on the 10th, and you do this lefi cheshbon, according to the calculation, meaning make sure that you're only going to take on the liter which you had from the previous year, because the gedul of hefker are potter from trumas and meiser. Okay, what's the raya? What's the Gemara's question? Obviously, that there's no bitla de karka, because what's the case talking about? You planted it. And you told me, for something that the issues de karka, you'll have bitla de karka. But here yet you see that it's going to be chayv and trumas and meiser, even though it was planted. So the Gemara continues and finishes off on the top of the Testament Aleph. Amri, they said, no, you have it all wrong. Meiser is not an isser karka. Why not? What else is it? What else is it? Digenhu de kogarim way. You know what makes something obligated meiser? It's not the fact that it grew and you didn't take off the meiser. It's when you put it into a pile in the granary, and then it has a chiva meiser, but not through the karka itself. You're not chayim in trumas meiser until it's a dogon, which means a pile, and this dogon was from the previous year. So therefore, you still have to take off meiser on that from the previous year. And that's not considered Issa de Karka, therefore, it's not going to bittul de Karka, but that does not refute what the Gemara had answered for B'yich and Rabbi Yinson, does not contradict them in their teachings, that we said that, although we came out, we showed you that Gidul Mavatla Se'ikah, that was only regards to laws of Shemitah, because Shemitah is Issa de Karka, it's a bittul de Karka. But others terms like Arla and Kalayim, the Rabbi Yinson are talking about, could be that we would not say that the Gedulan would be Vatla Se'ikah, because since this is now de Karka, even Meiser, which we just asked from, is also now de Karka, it's al de Dagan, therefore it's not going to have a Bitla de Karka, then any time.